On the morning of May 19th, 1536, a Queen of England walked to her execution. She wore a gray damask gown trimmed with fur. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a white coif, exposing her slender neck, the neck that would soon meet the sword. As Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold at the Tower of London, she looked out at the 1,000 faces watching her die. Many of those faces belonged to courtiers who had once bowed before her. Some had even helped her husband, King Henry VIII, build the case against her. The charges? Adultery, incest, treason, witchcraft. But here's what the history books often skip. One of the proofs of Anne's supposed witchcraft was her body itself, specifically her hands, because Anne Boleyn was rumored to have 6 fingers on one hand. And in Tudor England, physical deformities weren't just seen as bad luck. They were seen as marks of the devil. Did Anne Boleyn really have a 6th finger? And if she did, why did Henry marry her in the first place, only to use it as evidence to kill her? The answer reveals one of history's most brutal power plays, where a king rewrote reality itself to justify murdering the woman he'd once loved more than his kingdom. But before we get to the execution, you need to understand what this 6th finger really was, and why it became deadly. Anne Boleyn was born around 1501 to Sir Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious English diplomat, and his wife, Elizabeth Howard. From childhood, Anne was different from other noble girls of her time. She was educated in the French court, sophisticated, witty, fluent in French, skilled in music and dance. And yes, there was something unusual about her hand. Historical sources from Anne's lifetime describe what we would today call polydactyly, the presence of extra digits. But here's the critical detail most people get wrong. Anne Boleyn did not have a fully formed 6th finger dangling from her hand like a horror movie prop. What she likely had was a small growth on the side of one hand, possibly a vestigial 6th finger, or what's medically known as a rudimentary polydactyly. Some accounts describe it as a small nail-like protrusion. Others say it was barely noticeable, something she could hide with the long, flowing sleeves that were fashionable at the time. Nicholas Sander, a Catholic propagandist writing after Anne's death, described it this way. Anne Boleyn had a projecting tooth under the upper lip, and on her right hand, 6 fingers. But here's the thing about Sander. He was writing 50 years after Anne's death, and he hated her. He also claimed Anne had a large wen, a cyst, on her neck that she covered with jewelry, and that she was hideously ugly. These claims were contradicted by every contemporary account from people who actually met her. The truth? Anne was considered attractive by Tudor standards. Venetian ambassadors described her as having a pretty mouth and being of middling stature, with a swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, and eyes, which are black and beautiful. French poets praised her grace and charm. Even her enemies admitted she had charisma. But that small imperfection on her hand? In the early 1520s, when Anne first caught King Henry VIII's attention, it made her exotic, mysterious, different from all the other English roses at court. Henry VIII was 32 years old when he became obsessed with Anne Boleyn. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who had given him one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Henry needed a male heir. He needed a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. And he convinced himself that Anne Boleyn, this dark-eyed, quick-witted woman with the unusual hand, would give him that son. What Henry didn't realize was that his obsession with Anne's difference would eventually become the weapon used to destroy her. Here's where the story becomes a masterclass in psychological warfare. Anne Boleyn did something no royal mistress had done before. She said no. When Henry VIII first pursued her around 1526, he expected the same arrangement he'd had with Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn. A discreet affair, some gifts, maybe a title for her family. Standard Tudor mistress protocol. But Anne refused to sleep with him. She told Henry that she would only give herself to him as his wife, not his mistress, as his queen, not his whore. And then she did something even more daring. She left court. She went back to her family's estate at Haver Castle and made Henry come after her. It worked. Henry began writing her love letters. 17 survive to this day. In them, he calls her my mistress and friend, promises to make her his sole mistress, rejecting all others, and signs himself H seeks AB, no other R. Henry seeks Anne Boleyn, no other Rex, which means king. Think about that. The King of England, one of the most powerful men in Europe, was begging a commoner's daughter to love him back. But Anne had one massive problem: Catherine of Aragon. Henry was already married, and in 1527, Catholic Europe didn't recognize divorce. Henry would need an annulment from the Pope, a declaration that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place. Henry's argument? Catherine had been married to his older brother Arthur before Arthur died. The Bible, specifically Leviticus 20:21, said a man who marries his brother's wife would be childless, and Henry had no legitimate male heir. Therefore, God was punishing him. Therefore, the marriage must be annulled. It was absolute nonsense, and everyone knew it. Catherine insisted her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She'd been a virgin when she married Henry. The Pope refused the annulment. European politics, specifically that Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor, made it impossible. So Henry did the unthinkable. He broke with Rome entirely. Between 1527 and 1533, Henry VIII tore England away from the Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, divorced Catherine of Aragon, and married Anne Boleyn, all to make her his queen. The entire Reformation in England, one of the most significant religious upheavals in Western history, happened because Henry wanted to sleep with Anne Boleyn legally. And through it all, that small imperfection on her hand, it was exotic. It was unique. It was proof that Anne was special, chosen by God to be the mother of England's next king, until she failed to give Henry that king. Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII married secretly in January 1533. By the time of their public wedding in May, Anne was already visibly pregnant. Henry was ecstatic. His astrologers, his physicians, his prayers, everything pointed to this child being the son he'd torn England apart to conceive. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth at Greenwich Palace. The baby was healthy, beautiful, strong-lunged, and perfect in every way, except for one detail. The baby was a girl. They named her Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, the greatest monarch England would ever have. But in 1533, no one knew that. All they knew was that Henry had broken with Rome, divorced a beloved queen, married a controversial woman with a strange hand, and destroyed political alliances across Europe to get a daughter. The disappointment was crushing. The announcement letters had already been prepared, declaring the birth of a prince. Scribes had to hastily add an S to make it princess. But Henry still believed. Anne would have more children. She would give him a son, except she didn't. In 1534, Anne became pregnant again. Henry's hopes soared. And then, in the summer of 1534, Anne miscarried. The baby was reportedly male. Henry was patient. He loved her. He would wait. In 1535, Anne became pregnant a third time. By now, the whispers at court had begun. Why couldn't Anne Boleyn, this woman who'd promised Henry a son, deliver one? Was it God's punishment? Was her body cursed? Was she a witch after all? In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. Anne reportedly celebrated. Her rival was finally gone. Henry could relax, and Anne could safely deliver the son who would secure everything. But on the very day of Catherine's funeral, January 29, 1536, Anne miscarried again. This time, witnesses reported the fetus was male and appeared to be about 15 weeks developed. Henry visited her chamber once. He looked at her coldly and said, "I see that God will not give me male children." And then he added something chilling. "When you are up, I will speak with you." That was the moment Anne Boleyn's death sentence was written, even if no one knew it yet. Watch closely, because what happened next reveals how power really works in royal courts. That small imperfection on Anne's hand, the one that had made her exotic and special when Henry loved her, suddenly became something else entirely when he stopped loving her. It became evidence of witchcraft. By April 1536, just weeks after Anne's final miscarriage, rumors began circulating at court. Anonymous pamphlets appeared, whispered conversations in dark corridors, all saying the same thing. Anne Boleyn had bewitched the king. She had used dark magic to make him fall in love with her. She had used sorcery to destroy his marriage to the righteous Catherine. And the proof? Her deformed hand, the mark of the devil. This is where the propaganda machine truly kicked into gear. Suddenly, sources that had never mentioned Anne's hand before started describing it in grotesque detail. The small nail-like growth became a fully formed sixth finger. Some accounts added a third nipple. Others claimed she had a large mole on her neck that she hid with jewelry, a witch's mark where her familiar demon would suckle. Nicholas Sander, writing decades later, described Anne as having not just 6 fingers, but also projecting teeth, sallow skin, and a general air of ugliness. This was the same woman Venetian ambassadors had called beautiful just years earlier. But here's the truly sinister part. Henry VIII never officially accused Anne of witchcraft at her trial. He didn't have to. The whispers did his work for him. The rumors created the atmosphere. The physical evidence, her hand, was there for everyone to reinterpret through the lens of Henry's new narrative. Instead, Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, built a case around adultery and treason. The charges were that Anne had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, that she had conspired to murder the king, that she had mocked his sexual performance and his body. Every single charge was almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was laughable. One of her supposed lovers, Mark Smeaton, a court musician, confessed under torture. The others, including respected courtiers like Henry Norris and William Brereton, maintained their innocence even as they were condemned. The specific dates when Anne supposedly committed adultery? Historians have proven she was elsewhere, often in public, during most of them. The charge that she committed adultery in the Tower of London. The Tower records show she wasn't even there on that date. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Henry wanted Anne gone. He had already selected his next wife, Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane was pale, docile, and promised to be obedient in ways Anne never had been. Most importantly, Henry believed Jane would give him the son Anne had failed to deliver. The trial was a formality. Anne was already dead the moment Henry decided she had to be. On May the 15th, 36, Anne Boleyn was arrested at Greenwich and taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she'd spent the night before her coronation just 3 years earlier. She was held in the same royal apartments she'd stayed in as queen, but this time she was a prisoner. Anne's jailers reported that she went through cycles of hysteria and eerie calm. She laughed inappropriately. She spoke compulsively. She asked about the men who'd been arrested with her, apparently not understanding that her questions were being reported back to Cromwell and used against her. One detail she fixated on: whether she would be burned at the stake or beheaded. Burning was the traditional punishment for women convicted of treason in England. Beheading was more merciful, reserved for nobility. Anne kept asking which she would receive. Her jailers told her the king, in his mercy, had ordered beheading. Anne reportedly laughed and said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Then she put her hands around her neck and laughed again. That disturbing laugh that her jailers recorded, and that historians still find chilling today. On May 15, 1536, Anne was tried before a court of 27 peers in the Great Hall of the Tower. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided. Not a single person spoke in her defense. The verdict was predetermined, guilty on all counts. Her brother George was tried separately and also found guilty. The primary evidence against him? That he and Anne had mocked the king's sexual performance and his inability to father sons. In Tudor England, questioning the king's virility was treason. George was executed on May 17, 1536. He was beheaded on Tower Hill in front of a large crowd. Anne was scheduled to die the next day, but the execution was delayed. Why? Because Henry had summoned a special executioner from Calais, an expert swordsman rather than the traditional English axeman. Henry wanted Anne's death to be swift and clean. Some historians interpret this as a final gesture of mercy toward a woman he'd once loved. Others see it as Henry managing his public image. He didn't want a botched execution to create sympathy for Anne. While Anne waited those extra days in the Tower, she received communion, prayed constantly, and composed herself. By all accounts, she faced her death with remarkable courage and dignity. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to a scaffold erected on Tower Green, a private execution ground within the Tower of London, not the public Tower Hill where common criminals died. She wore a gray damask gown and a red underskirt, the red symbolizing martyrdom. Her hair was pinned up, her neck exposed. She had dressed for her own death. Anne climbed the scaffold and addressed the small crowd of nobles and officials who'd been allowed to attend. Her speech was carefully crafted. She knew Henry would read the transcript. She praised the king, said she'd come there to die according to law, and asked the crowd to pray for the king. She did not proclaim her innocence. She could not. To do so would be to call the king's judgment into question, which could endanger her daughter Elizabeth. So Anne played her final role perfectly, the obedient subject accepting the king's justice. But there was one moment of defiance. When she knelt, she reportedly said to the executioner, "Pray do not strike until I give the signal." She wanted to control one last thing, the exact moment of her death. Anne knelt upright, rather than laying her head on a block. The French swordsman stood behind her. She closed her eyes, began to pray, and then, at the moment she chose, gave the signal. The sword fell. It was so swift, so sharp, that witnesses said Anne's lips were still moving in prayer after her head was severed. She was approximately 35 years old. She'd been Queen of England for less than 3 years. Her body and head were placed in an elm arrow chest. No proper coffin had been prepared, and buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the Tower. The day after Anne's execution, Henry VIII became officially betrothed to Jane Seymour. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane. That's right, 11 days. The man who'd torn England apart to marry Anne, who'd broken with Rome and created the Church of England for her, who'd written her love letters and called her the love of his life. That man was in bed with her replacement less than 2 weeks after having her beheaded. Jane Seymour would eventually give Henry his son, the future Edward VI, but she died 12 days after childbirth. Edward VI became king at age 9 and died at 15, never producing an heir. All of Henry's desperate son hunting, all the wives, all the executions, and in the end, it was Anne Boleyn's daughter who became the greatest monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years. She never married. She transformed England into a global power. Her reign became known as the Golden Age. She was everything Henry had hoped for in a son and more. But Elizabeth grew up knowing her father had executed her mother based on false charges. She grew up knowing her mother had been called a witch, an adulteress, a traitor, all lies designed to justify a king's cruelty. Elizabeth never spoke publicly about her mother. It was too dangerous. But in private, she wore a ring that contained two portraits, one of herself and one of Anne Boleyn. She kept her mother's face close to her heart her entire life. As for the sixth finger, modern historians largely agree that if Anne had any digital abnormality at all, it was minor, possibly just a small nail or skin tag. Contemporary portraits of Anne show normal hands. Her enemies during her lifetime, including those who hated her, never mentioned a sixth finger. The grotesque descriptions only appeared after her death, when it was safe to slander her. When Henry needed to justify having executed a queen, when the victors were rewriting history. The sixth finger wasn't evidence of witchcraft. It was evidence of propaganda. It was evidence of how power works, how those in control can take a small imperfection, a tiny difference, and transform it into proof of monstrosity. How something that made you special and exotic when you were loved becomes proof of your evil when you're no longer wanted. Anne Boleyn's sixth finger, real or exaggerated, became a symbol, a reminder that in the game of royal power, even your body isn't truly yours. It's a tool that can be used for you or against you, depending on who controls the narrative. So, what do we take from Anne Boleyn's story? On the surface, it's a story about a king's cruelty, a political execution dressed up as justice, a woman destroyed by the same man who'd once moved heaven and earth to possess her. But dig deeper, and it's about something far more universal: the weaponization of difference. When Henry loved Anne, her uniqueness made her special. The moment he wanted rid of her, that same uniqueness became evidence of her monstrosity. Her exotic hand became the devil's mark. Her intelligence became cunning. Her refusal to be a submissive mistress became proof of her unnatural ambition. This is how power destroys people. Not by inventing lies from nothing, but by taking truths and twisting them until they serve a different purpose. Anne Boleyn did have something unusual about her hand. Probably. She was intelligent, ambitious, and sexually confident. Definitely. She had failed to give Henry a son, tragically. But none of that made her a witch. None of that made her guilty of adultery or treason. None of that deserved execution. What killed Anne Boleyn wasn't her sixth finger. It was a king who believed he had the right to rewrite reality itself to suit his desires. A court system so corrupt it would condemn an innocent woman on fabricated charges. And a society willing to believe the worst about a powerful woman because it was easier than questioning their king. The sixth finger was just the excuse. The symbol. The mark they pointed to and said, "See? We always knew she was different. We always knew she was dangerous." And perhaps that's the most chilling part of this story. Not that Henry VIII was a tyrant who executed his wife. We knew that already. But that hundreds of people around him were willing to go along with it. Willing to fabricate evidence. Willing to testify falsely. Willing to execute an innocent woman and 5 innocent men. All because a king wanted a do-over. All because a king couldn't admit he'd made a mistake. All because a king needed someone to blame for his own failures. Anne Boleyn's sixth finger didn't kill her. Henry VIII's ego did. And 500 years later, we're still talking about that sixth finger. Still letting Henry's propaganda do its work. Still focusing on Anne's body rather than on the injustice of her death. Maybe it's time we stopped asking whether Anne Boleyn really had a sixth finger and started asking why it mattered. Why her body became evidence. Why difference became monstrosity. Why a queen died so a king could save face. Because the answer to those questions tells us far more about power, gender, and justice than any debate about her anatomy ever could. Anne Boleyn was executed for having a sixth finger. But really, she was executed for being a woman who dared to say no to a king, who failed to fulfill his expectations, and who became inconvenient. The sixth finger was just the story Henry told to make it acceptable. And we've been repeating that story ever since.